Due Process awarded 9 Emmys, including the 2005 New York Emmy for Outstanding Crime Reporting Programming. Major funding for Due Process provided by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law, and by the Fund for New Jersey, supporting informed citizens for an effective democracy. Additional funding provided by Lawyer's Diary and Manual and online legal reference, elaw.com.
Years ago, something happened here in Newark from which we've never quite recovered. I'm Raymond Brown, and it was July 1967 when the city erupted in anger and violence born of social, economic, and legal injustice. Why it happened and what's happened since is our focus for the next 2 special editions of Due Process. To mark the 40th anniversary of the Newark disorders, Sandy King brought together an extraordinary group of activists and experts, pundits and politicians to appraise where the city has been and where it's going. Here then, part 1 of their conversation.
We're here in Newark to look back at what happened and why, at what it meant in the short term and through all these years since. So I've invited 8 carefully chosen guests to join me here. Different backgrounds, different points of view, but all of us heavily invested in this city where we all live and work. And all of us still haunted by that other July 40 years ago. We begin with Dr. Robert Curvin. Today, Bob's a Princeton PhD who does public policy consulting. But in 1967, he was a local civil rights leader on the scene in those crucial first hours. Clem Price is a Rutgers Distinguished Professor who hadn't yet come to Newark in '67, but today is the preeminent historian of this city. Maria Viscarando and her family had just moved to Newark weeks before the disorders. But they stayed, and today she heads the New Newark Department of Child and Family Well-Being. Father William Linder in '67 was a young priest in the Central Ward. He went on to build the largest, most successful community development program in the United States. Junius Williams hadn't been here long in July of '67, but he'd brought the skills he'd learned at Yale Law School to the struggles here both before and after the upheaval. And today he heads the Abbott Leadership Institute at Rutgers. Frederica Bay saw the tanks from her window, and a political activist was born. Today she heads the Women in Support of the Million Man March, which has become an important player on the social service and advocacy scene. But for Newark, Steve Adubato wrote the book on combining the roles of political power broker and service provider. His North Ward Center and his Robert Tree Charter School are national models, and he remains a major force on the political scene. No one knows that better than Cory Booker. He wasn't yet born in '67 and came here only after he gained credentials at Stanford, Oxford, and Yale Law School. But 1 year ago, he became just the 3rd Newark mayor in 36 years.
The future is now. The future is Newark. God bless our city.
Mayor, welcome, and welcome to you all. Let me begin by asking you whether we in Newark have defined ourselves or allowed ourselves to become defined by July '67. Bob?
Oh, I think that a lot of people would like to define Newark and Newarkers by 1967, but anyone who knows the city and knows the people of the city has a much different perspective, I think. And 67 certainly was a traumatic and almost indelible series of events. However, the city is much larger, much greater, historically much more diverse and significant than that. And I think that we as Newarkers were not to let people, in fact, define us by 1967.
But is it the image, the profile that has been hung on us and that perhaps we've also embraced, Father Linder?
Well, I think some of we've embraced in the sense that we have the controls. We have to really take the power and do something to change that image. And that image isn't in PR, that image is rebuilding a city and rebuilding it for the people who live here. I mean, when you consider the spirit of people that survived these 40 years, it's remarkable. They are remarkable.
You've worked with so many of those people. Has the rebellion of '67 hampered us in a way that perhaps we shouldn't have allowed it to?
I don't really think so, Sandy. I embrace the rebellions of 1967 because it showed that black people had some life after over 400 years of servitude, chattel, slavery, and never getting any counseling or reparations, as so many other people have gotten. I had so many mixed emotions during that time, but the biggest of it was, God, we're alive, because as Amiri Baraka said, and he said it just right, this was apartheid. Newark was apartheid prior to the '67 rebellions, and anything could have sparked it off, but the beating of the taxicab driver did, and so it was like we knew somebody was going to die, but somebody always dies in rebellions and civil unrest.
Steve, in the North Ward, in your part of town, which of course has changed enormously in these last 40 years, was the defining moment for Newark, July of 1967, 40 years ago tonight?
Instantly. Hours. Everything changed. It never was going to be as it was. Thank God, because we were in great serious sin in this country. And the people who couldn't stand it left very quickly. Not just whites, middle class. But look at this. There are 8 people here in this panel, Newarkers, and you, Sandy, a Newarker. 9. Look at the people that we have, the resource, this human resource that we have. Urban America is the most difficult part of our society. Newark, as you know, is the largest urban center, the largest urban state. We have a lot of problems, but we have great people.
Mayor Booker, you weren't alive in '67, so you certainly weren't here, but I've heard you talk a lot about what happened in July of '67. It's something that is clearly on your mind, and not just tonight.
It's always on my mind. It's our history. We are who we are because of what came before. And I don't even want to focus on that point, which was like the tip of a sword or a tip of a pin. Really, there's a whole historical happenings in American cities all over, especially northeastern American cities, that can't be ignored. Especially the savage inequalities that were existent. And that persistent disadvantage really was what enabled the riots to actually happen. So to me, that is what still is very apparent in my mind, because frankly, we still are a nation that has not healed, and not healed from its riots. We're not a nation that has really fully manifested its creed, that we are one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
We also have never been really one city, and so Maria, I wonder in the Latino community what the riot meant.
Well, for me, it was very interesting because I had been living in the city a whole of 12 days when the riots occurred. And my mother came to live to Newark with her 3 daughters, looking for a better life. There were more factories to work in. A lot in New York City had closed. So we were here looking for a better quality of life. And I have to tell you, one of the biggest problems I had when I first got here was the polarization of people that I didn't find growing up in East Harlem. And right after, when the riots occurred, I was sitting there witnessing all that was going on. And the one thing that affected me the most immediately was the fact that the African-American neighbors that I thought had become friends also started seeing me as part of the problem. And so the Latinos that were in that particular situation found themselves victims of the situation that was occurring. And that was a very difficult situation to handle at the time, because you didn't fit, you really didn't fit anywhere.
And one I want to get back to talk about, but I also want to talk about language. It's become politically correct to call what happened 40 years ago rebellion or insurrection or even revolution. But for most of the last 4 decades, most of us have called it simply the riot. So does it matter what name we use? We put that question to Cornel West.
Oh, it makes a big difference. It was rebellion. People who had been dehumanized, dishonored, disrespected, segregated, subjugated. No, that's rebellion. Anytime you got a boot on your neck, and all of a sudden you straighten your back up, that's a rebellion. It was clear that the depth of white supremacy in America had to be confronted. The system itself was not responding in the way that it ought. It was moving too slow, and the rage that overwhelmed the system resulted in a challenge to the system. It was a threat to the system, and so the powers that be had to make concessions. They began to open up businesses. They began to slowly desegregate the various other institutions. And so I think we have to acknowledge the degree to which the people in motion, even when it's motivated by a rage, does have some effects and consequences that take the form of forcing people to come to terms with a problem that's deeply entrenched from America's beginning.
Clem Price, what do you make of Professor West's analysis?
Well, his analysis is informed by the last 40 years. The fact of the matter is, over this generation, we Newarkers, we Americans have learned to challenge old perceptions. So what used to be a riot is now a rebellion or a revolution. Quite frankly, that's what happens in a democratic society such as ours. We agree to disagree until we reach almost like a common ground where one word or one concept speaks across the generation. As a historian, I have noticed that 2 things. First of all, 1967, no matter what one calls those 5 days and the era that surrounds those 5 days, it's the defining moment of Newark's 20th century. Anyone who was in Newark has talked about those 5 days for the rest of their lives. We need to take that very seriously. People don't forget a defining moment of such stature as the rebellion of 1967.
And yet, what Frederica was talking about, that in fact it was not just the defining moment, but such an important change to open the doors to new opportunity, to open the doors to black leadership. Junius, before we leave the events of those 5 days, you said something that was very short but very profound in the documentary. You said the police rioted. Still the way you'd see it?
Yes. Yes, there was a rebellion and there was a riot within the rebellion. The subtext for the rebellion was resistance, and I don't think we talk about that enough. The riot wasn't planned, nobody wanted it, nobody could predict where it was, but it was one of those moments in history where people had great expectations based upon the civil rights movement.
Great frustration.
Well, no, it wasn't just frustration. You see, people are frustrated now. People can be angry now, but people knew that something was wrong. The contradictions were exposed in America because of the organized resistance in this town, all the organizations that were there.
And can I just interject? First
Sure.
of all, I don't like people who try to tie up history in a really neat way. It was a riot, it was a rebellion, it was an upheaval,
so it was
a
of
revolution. Why do we have to say it was one thing? There were different people doing so many different things within that concentrated period of time. But the one thing that doesn't get spoken about, the focus is always on African Americans in Newark. But if you look at the National Guard during that time, 1,300 rounds of bullets that they could not account for. And the allegations, the most serious of the allegations was that there were 100 to 150 bullets fired by so-called snipers or whatever you call them. There was illegality and immorality spread widely that was going on during that period. So this was not neat, this was not clean. It was a very ugly period, but it was also people standing up and for once just demanding justice and attention and focus on a problem that had been going on for decades before that. So as I look at this enduring thing, I don't think we've healed in many ways because we haven't confronted the ugliness of that history. Nobody was indicted for shooting indiscriminately at public housing projects. The people that died were mostly killed, frankly, by the bullets of people that were so-called sent there to protect folks. So I think that still is a rub. But the reality is now the enduring lessons, I think, has to be that we didn't clean it up in the 1960s or the 70s or the 80s or the 90s. We have persistent inequalities that still exist that we must heal if we're ever to become the great nation we aspire to be.
Mayor, right there, let me just turn to Sally Carroll. As we saw in Newark, the slow road back, maybe the saddest symbol of police excess in '67 was the murder of Eloise Spellman.
The shooting of Mrs. Spellman was something that was just so hurtful to everybody concerned. There's a woman who looked out of her window on the, what was she, the 11th or 12th floor, and 11 children to be shot dead. She was just blown away. They had just fired at will, fired at everybody. And it was terrible, a terrible time.
And you've got some artifacts to remind us.
Yes, these, all of this went to the apartment beneath hers, and the residents there had swept up all these different kinds of bullets and shells and casings. Oh, they just laid down a barrage into a fully occupied high-rise apartment. And it was just, it's a wonder more people weren't killed.
And it's a wonder that a child could survive seeing her mother shot down without cause. But I'm happy to report this update on Crystal Spellman, who was featured in Slow Road. Now in her 40s, Crystal just this year became a graduate of Rutgers Newark. That's the good news. The bad news is that she has now moved out of Newark, as have so many others. Bob, is that also part of our story of the last 40 years?
I don't think it's bad news for someone to express their desire to enjoy what America really fundamentally offers, and that's mobility.
But bad for our city, isn't it?
Well, all cities face the fact that people grow up, they go to school, they learn, they look at other options, and they leave.
So should we not be sad, Frederica, that someone like Crystal Spellman, who could bring so much to this city, has decided it isn't where she wants to live?
I loved Crystal and what she said and how she dealt with that horrendous, you know, being such a baby and seeing her mother taken from her and the 11 children and the families being separated as happened to us in chattel slavery, and how she pulled herself up. So whatever Crystal wanted to do, I think is a good thing. It's fine. However, it's still about who gets what, okay? And that's what apartheid is about, who gets what. White people get it all, black people get none, and that's why the rebellion.
Steve? You're smiling.
That's funny. White people think black people get it all. They're both wrong. It's for the taking. It's education's the key to everybody. How could we say it's wrong for people who want to better their life? That young lady wants a future for her children. She's right. You know, we talk about crime and killings, and that's the most awful thing, you would think. But a whole generation of kids, over 40,000 kids, not getting a chance for the future. That's crime, you know, that's bigger than anything, and it's happening in Newark right now. In these 37 years of black leadership, we have not done it. Black leadership is not the answer. Blacks want to believe romantically, and you know something? Humanly, it's right, but actually, it's terrible. The resources of America have to be used to cure Newark.
Frederica, let me just bring Junius in here, because Junius was shaking his head and not looking happy during Steve's delivery.
See,
Junius will take care of it.
It's a matter of government for who. Be grammatically correct, government for whom. Now, Steve, black leadership in Newark has been very good to you.
I've been very good. I would say the other way around.
I think that you, among all people, should not be complaining about black leadership. You know, I can think of a whole lot of black people that got far less than what you got.
Absolutely.
Now, we're not going to talk about that. Let's go back to talking about the Spelman situation and put it in the proper context.
Let's stay with 67 for the moment. We're going to bring it up.
All right. Well, I want to just add to what has been said here, because you see what we have here is a failure coming out of the 60s to analyze the class implications of what Newark became after 1967, including black power. You see, there are a lot of people who embraced black power because it meant we were going to bring everybody up. Everybody was going to learn how to become his or her own leader. But when we get to a city government, what makes it possible for Steve to say what he's saying is because there has been a disparity in who gets what.
Exactly.
And everybody who we thought was going to get something didn't get it.
Before we bring it up to who got what, let's stay with 67 for the moment, Clem.
Newark, perhaps more than any other city, was if you will, almost a basket case, almost rendered a basket case because of the racism that was found on state, federal, and local policies having to do with where people lived, having to do where people could move, having to do with education. The historian's task has just about been completed with respect to that period in our history.
Mayor, you were talking about the fact that there had been no prosecution of the people who were responsible for the 26 deaths. And the late Ron Parambo, he wrote an angry book with the ironic title, No Cause for Indictment. And in fact, no one ever was indicted for any of those riot deaths. We asked David Satz, New Jersey's U.S. attorney back then, why not?
As far as the 26, there were people who were killed, and you just know that it was wrongdoing to shoot up a kid that's cornered in a cellar. Try to identify the trooper and who did what with whom. We tried to do, but became impossible.
Bob, you were there. Was it impossible to place blame?
Well, I want to point out that there's an aspect of this that has not been discussed very much, and that is that the governor and the mayor and the authorities articulated very ambiguous orders to the security forces. And in the minds of many police, and if you in fact go back and read the press clippings and look at the videos, you will hear something to the effect that there was an order to shoot to kill.
There were credible witnesses. I interviewed some of those witnesses. I had law students working for me. I had people all over the city looking for witnesses to this police violence. We put this information before the grand jury. The grand jury called me in and said, well, don't you think, Mr. Williams, it's inflammatory that a picture went out showing this dead man with 39 bullet holes in him, 4 in the top of his head? I asked him, don't you think it's inflammatory that the police shot him 39 times?
But just as we know, Juniors, that you can indict a ham sandwich if the prosecution is leading, you can also not indict someone who is blatantly guilty.
I think also was important, I was a teenager, and I can tell you that there wasn't a person in my neighborhood who felt anything more, you felt like a criminal, because you were never treated as the law enforcement came into your community, they weren't protecting you. You became one of those same criminals by virtue of being a Newark resident. And I think that says a lot about how people saw this as any kind. It was not seen as anybody rescuing a community, it was a community under siege.
You've been watching part one of an important conversation on the roots and results of the civil disorders here in Newark. We hope you'll join us again next week for part two of this due process special event. And one final due process note. Sandy King has just won the New York Deadline Club's coveted Rube Award for her report on jailhouse lawyers. We congratulate Sandy on her unprecedented 4th win of this major journalism honor. For Sandy and all of us here, I'm Raymond Brown. Thanks for watching Due Process.
I think that in '67, there was probably a deeper consensus on the value of education in this town. And we must reclaim that.
It's changed in the sense of what we did accomplish as opposed to what we thought we would accomplish. And given me some kind of indication of what still has to be done.
I think what they need in Newark is, frankly, less a performing arts center, more middle-class housing, more middle-class people, and some decent combination of whites and blacks.
Newark has a long way to go, to be sure. But they don't have nearly as far to go as they have come.
Watts 65, Newark 67, Detroit 67. Those are fundamental truths that we have to come to terms with.
The younger people coming along really don't have much of a framework, you know, to put things in context. And for them to read about it and watch it and see and find out exactly what happened, I think is healthy.
Major funding for due process provided by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law, and by the Fund for New Jersey, supporting informed citizens for an effective democracy. Additional funding provided by Lawyer's Diary and Manual and online legal reference, elaw.com.